July 14th, 1944. Arrow 623 hours, 3 kilometers south of St. Lo, France. Sergeant Curtis Culin pressed his cheek against the front glacis plate of a Sherman tank that was 73 seconds away from becoming a coffin for 5 men, and he knew exactly how to stop it from happening. His hands, scarred from 8 years of changing taxi tires in Hell's Kitchen, weren't holding a wrench or a rifle. They were gripping a crude steel fork he'd welded onto the tank's nose the night before, using scrap metal that 48 hours earlier had been part of Adolf Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The steel teeth jutted forward like tusks on some prehistoric beast, and they had no business being on a United States Army tank. They violated basic armored doctrine. They'd never been tested. They'd never been approved by ordnance. And in exactly 73 seconds, they were either going to save 5 lives or get Culin court-martialed for destroying government property. The hedgerow loomed 15 meters ahead, ancient, impenetrable, 8 meters tall and 4 meters thick, a living wall of earth and roots and bramble that had divided Norman farmland since the time of Charlemagne. Behind it, 3 German MG-42 machine guns waited in positions their crews had occupied for 6 weeks, positions they knew down to the millimeter, positions from which they'd already killed 47 American tank crewmen in the past 9 days. The Germans had figured out the math. When a Sherman tried to climb over a hedgerow, it exposed its thin belly armor at a 35-degree angle for approximately 4 seconds. One Panzerfaust round properly aimed at the engine compartment, and the tank became a furnace. The crew had 11 seconds to evacuate before the ammunition cooked off. Most didn't make it. Cullen's hands tightened on the welded steel. The Sherman's engine roared, a cacophony of 500 horsepower that vibrated through his bones. Inside the tank, Lieutenant Jack Morrison was saying something over the intercom, probably asking if Culin had lost his mind volunteering to ride on the front of a tank heading straight into German guns. Culin couldn't hear him over the engine. Didn't matter. Morrison had his orders, Culin had his conviction, and somewhere in the hedgerows ahead, German gunners were adjusting their sights, their fingers light on triggers, waiting for the moment when 33 tons of American steel would rear up like a target at a shooting gallery. The Sherman lurched forward, 50 meters to the hedgerow. Culin flattened himself against the armor, making his body as small as possible. Bullets had already started hitting the tank, that distinct metallic whine of rifle rounds deflecting off hardened steel. The Germans weren't wasting machine gun ammunition yet. They were waiting. They always waited. They'd learned patience from 47 previous kills. They knew the script. Tank approaches hedgerow. Tank tries to climb. Tank exposes belly. Tank burns. They'd done it so many times they probably didn't even need to aim anymore. 40 meters. Culin could see the hedgerow's details now, the thickness of the roots, the density of the undergrowth, the dark shadows where German positions were hidden. Somewhere in his peripheral vision, he registered movement in the field to his right. Another Sherman trying to flank around to find a gap in the hedge network. It wouldn't find one. The Norman bocage was 3,600 square kilometers of natural fortress. Every field surrounded by hedgerows. Every hedgerow a potential kill zone. The Germans had spent 6 weeks fortifying them, turning every farm lane into a death trap. Since D-Day, the American advance had covered less than 8 kilometers inland from the beaches. 8 kilometers in 38 days. Men were calling it the worst fighting since Verdun. 30 meters. The bullets were coming faster now. Still rifles. The Germans were disciplined. Machine guns would give away their positions. They'd wait until the last second, until the tank was committed, until escape was impossible. That's what they'd done to Baker Company 3 days ago. Waited until 4 Shermans were bunched up at a single hedgerow, then opened fire from 3 sides simultaneously. 14 men had died before anyone could even call for artillery support. 20 meters. Culin felt his jaw clench. This was it. This was the moment that would either prove he was right or prove he was an idiot who'd gotten 5 men killed because he thought he knew better than Army ordnance. The steel forks he'd welded on weren't elegant. They weren't pretty. They were 4 pieces of German beach obstacle steel, each 1 meter long, arranged in a configuration that looked like a medieval battering ram. He'd spent 6 hours cutting them with a torch, another 4 hours welding them into place, while Morrison watched skeptically, and the rest of the platoon took bets on whether Culin had cracked under pressure. The math was simple. The hedgerows were earth and roots. Earth compressed when you hit it. Roots had shear strength. But if you hit earth and roots with enough concentrated force at the right angle, they'd part like fabric tearing. Standard Sherman doctrine was to climb over hedgerows, which exposed the belly. Culin's forks would cut through them, keeping the tank level, keeping the armor angled, keeping the crew alive. That was the theory. He'd tested it exactly 0 times. There'd been no time. Yesterday afternoon, General Omar Bradley's headquarters had issued orders for a massive offensive to break out of the bocage. Operation Cobra. Start date July 25th. That gave the Army 11 days to figure out how to get tanks through hedgerows without losing half the armored force. 10 meters. The Sherman was picking up speed now, Morrison giving it full throttle. The steel forks vibrated so hard Culin could feel his teeth rattling. Behind the tank, 1st Platoon was spread out in combat formation, 37 men watching to see if their sergeant's crazy idea would work, or if they were about to witness another tank burn. Some of them had known Culin in New York. They'd ridden in his cab when he'd worked the night shift driving drunks home from Manhattan speakeasies. Now they were watching him ride point on an untested modification that could either win the war or blow up in spectacular fashion. 5 meters. The hedgerow filled Culin's vision. Up close, it wasn't beautiful. It was ancient and cruel, a barrier that had divided land since before America existed, and now it was dividing armies, turning modern mechanized warfare into something medieval and grinding. The roots at the base were thick as a man's thigh. The earth was packed so hard it looked like concrete. The Germans had reinforced some hedgerows with mines and wire and logs. This one looked natural, which meant it might be worse. Natural hedgerows had root systems that went down 4 meters. You couldn't blow them up. You couldn't dig under them. You could only go over them, which meant dying. The steel forks made contact. There was a sound Culin had never heard before, something between a crunch and a tear. Metal meeting earth at 15 kilometers per hour, 33 tons of tank behind it. The Sherman didn't slow down. It didn't climb. It pushed forward, and the hedgerow didn't resist the way hedgerows were supposed to resist. The steel forks were digging in, cutting down. The angle was right, the force was right, and for the first time in 38 days, an American tank was going through a Norman hedgerow instead of over it. The Germans opened fire, not rifles now, machine guns. The MG-42s had a cyclic rate of 200 rounds per minute, a sound like ripping canvas amplified through hell. Bullets hit the Sherman's front armor, hundreds of them, sparks flying, ricochets whining off into the morning air. Culin couldn't see the muzzle flashes. He was inside the hedgerow now, inside a tunnel of roots and earth and steel, and the Sherman was still moving forward. The transmission was screaming, the engine was roaring, and the hedgerow was splitting open like it had been cut with a knife. 3 seconds. That's how long it took for 33 tons of American steel with 4 pieces of German obstacle steel welded to its nose to punch through 8 meters of hedgerow that had stopped every previous attempt. 3 seconds. And then the Sherman was through, and Curtis Culin was staring at 3 very surprised German machine gun crews who'd been expecting a tank to appear above them, not in front of them. Morrison didn't wait for orders. The Sherman's bow machine gun opened up, then the 75mm main gun, then the coaxial gun. The German positions disintegrated. 1 MG-42 crew tried to traverse their weapon. They were too slow. The Sherman's main gun put a high explosive round into their position from 23 meters away. The second crew ran. The third crew was still running when the Sherman's bow gun cut them down. Culin slapped the turret twice, the signal to stop. Morrison brought the Sherman to a halt on the other side of the hedgerow. In the field, the Germans had held for 6 weeks. Behind them, through the gap in the hedgerow, Culin could see 1st Platoon staring. Lieutenant Morrison's voice came through the turret, tinny and distant. "Sergeant Culin, did we just—" "Yeah," Culin said. His hands were still gripping the steel forks. They were warm now, heated by friction with the earth. They were also intact. Not bent, not broken, not torn off the tank. Intact and functional and ready to do it again. "Yeah, we just went through." There was a moment of silence. Then, from somewhere back in 1st Platoon's position, someone started cheering. Then someone else. Then the whole platoon was yelling, and Culin realized they'd been holding their breath, waiting to see if he'd get them all killed. And now they were celebrating because a New York cab driver had just figured out how to beat a German defensive system that had stalled 2 entire American armies. Morrison climbed out of the turret. He was 23 years old, fresh from Fort Knox, had been in command of 2nd Platoon for exactly 11 days. He looked at Culin. He looked at the steel forks. He looked at the gap in the hedgerow. He looked at what was left of the German position. Then he looked back at Culin and said the words that would change everything. "Sergeant, how fast can you make more of those?" Culin thought about the scrap pile back at the battalion motor pool, thought about the hundreds of German beach obstacles they'd driven past on Utah Beach, twisted steel crosses designed by Rommel himself to stop landing craft, now just sitting there rusting in the sand. Thought about the 743rd Tank Battalion's maintenance company, 6 welders and 47 Sherman tanks. Thought about Operation Cobra, scheduled to start in 11 days, an operation that required tanks to break through hedgerows without dying. Thought about 47 dead crewmen in 9 days. Thought about how many more would die if someone didn't fix this problem right now. "Sir," Culin said, "give me 72 hours and I'll put these on every Sherman in the battalion." Morrison nodded. Then he did something Culin didn't expect. He reached down, grabbed one of the steel forks and tried to bend it. Couldn't. The weld held. The steel held. Morrison looked at it for a long moment, then looked up at Culin. "What do you call it?" Culin hadn't thought about that. He glanced back at the hedgerow, at the gap they'd torn through it, at the German positions beyond. The steel forks looked like horns now, like tusks, like something prehistoric and unstoppable, like a rhino. "Don't know, sir. Just something to get us through." "Well, whatever it is," Morrison said, "you just saved 5 lives. Probably saved 50. Probably gonna save 500 before this is over." He was smiling now, the kind of smile men get when they realize they're not going to die today. Battalion's gonna want to know about this. And that's when Culin realized he'd done something that couldn't be undone. He'd modified government property without authorization. He'd welded scrap metal onto a tank using untested specifications. He'd violated every ordnance regulation in the book, and he'd done it all in full view of his platoon, his lieutenant, and probably a dozen other witnesses who'd watched the whole thing happen. He could be court-martialed, he could be busted down to private, he could be transferred to some punishment detail in the rear, or he could be the man who figured out how to break through the bocage, the man who saved Operation Cobra, the man who changed the war. But first, he'd have to convince battalion, then regiment, then division, then everyone all the way up to Bradley himself that a cab driver from Hell's Kitchen had solved a problem that had stumped the entire U.S. Army for 38 days. Curtis Culin looked at his hands. They were black with grease and carbon scoring from the welding torch. He looked at the steel forks on the Sherman's nose. They were ugly and improvised and perfect. He looked at the gap in the hedgerow, at the field beyond, at the road that led to St. Lo, and he thought about something his father had told him once, back when he was 16 and working in his father's garage in Brooklyn. "Son, the difference between a mechanic and an engineer is that engineers design things that work on paper. Mechanics design things that work." This worked. Whatever happened next, this worked. And somewhere, 3 kilometers south of St. Lo, in a field that had been German territory for 6 weeks and was now American territory as of 3 minutes ago, Curtis Culin made a decision that would change the course of the European theater and almost get him killed in the process. "Lieutenant," he said, "I'll need to talk to Colonel Toffee, and I'll need every welder in the battalion, and I'll need access to those beach obstacles on Utah Beach. And, sir," he paused. Morrison was staring at him. "I'll need you to not mention this to anyone until I've got at least 12 more tanks ready, because if battalion shuts this down before we can prove it works, Operation Cobra is going to fail, and a lot of good men are going to die because someone in headquarters thought doctrine was more important than results." Morrison was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. 72 hours, Sergeant. I'll give you 72 hours to make this work. After that, battalion's going to hear about it whether we want them to or not. Too many people saw what just happened. And that was it. That was the moment when a cab driver's improvised solution became a race against time, against doctrine, against the German army, and against everyone in the chain of command who'd think Curtis Culin was out of his mind for welding scrap metal onto million-dollar tanks without permission. 72 hours to build enough modified Shermans to prove the concept. 72 hours to change how armored warfare worked. 72 hours before someone either gave him a medal or threw him in the stockade. Culin looked back at 1st Platoon. They were still standing there, still staring at the gap in the hedgerow, He could see it in their faces. They'd watched men die in hedgerows for 38 days. They'd watched tanks burn. They'd listened to the screams of crews trapped inside steel furnaces. And now they'd watched one Sherman go through a hedgerow like it wasn't even there. And they wanted more. They wanted every tank in the battalion to have those steel forks. They wanted to stop dying in hedgerows. The sun was coming up over St. Lo, casting long shadows across the Norman farmland. Somewhere to the south, artillery was starting up, the daily grind of incremental advances and bloody stalemates. Somewhere to the north, General Bradley was planning Operation Cobra, calculating how many tanks he'd need, how many men he'd lose, how many hedgerows they'd have to punch through to break out of Normandy and start the drive toward Germany. Bradley didn't know it yet, but in 72 hours, a cab driver from Hell's Kitchen was going to hand him the key to victory. And it was going to cost exactly $3 worth of scrap steel per tank. But first, Curtis Culin had to figure out how to build 47 more of these devices without getting arrested. And he had to do it fast, because Operation Cobra wasn't going to wait. The Germans weren't going to wait. And somewhere in those hedgerows, enemy machine gun crews were already repositioning, already preparing for the next American attack, already assuming that what they'd just witnessed was a fluke, an accident, something that couldn't possibly be repeated. They were wrong. Curtis Culin was going to repeat it 47 times, maybe more. And by the time he was done, the bocage of Normandy was going to turn from Germany's greatest defensive advantage into their worst nightmare. But that was still 72 hours away. Right now, standing next to a Sherman tank with improvised steel forks welded to its nose, with a platoon of infantry staring at him like he'd just performed a miracle, Curtis Culin had to make the most important decision of his life. Tell battalion now and risk getting shut down. Or keep quiet, build more devices, and present them with a fait accompli that was too successful to reject. Morrison was watching him, waiting. First Platoon was watching him, waiting. Somewhere in the German lines, observers were probably watching through binoculars, trying to figure out what the hell had just happened to their impenetrable hedgerow defense. Curtis Culin made his choice. "Lieutenant," he said, "I'm going back to the motor pool. Tell the captain I'm conducting battlefield repairs. Tell him I'll have a full report in 3 days. And, sir," he paused, making sure Morrison understood what he was asking. "Tell him not to send anyone to check on me until I'm done. Because what I'm about to do, it's gonna look crazy, but it's gonna work. And when Operation Cobra kicks off, we're gonna go through those hedgerows like they're made of paper, and the Germans are gonna wonder what the hell hit them." Morrison grinned. It was the first time Culin had seen him smile since he'd arrived at the battalion. 72 hours, Sergeant. Make them count. And Curtis Culin did something he never thought he'd do. He saluted, not because he had to, not because doctrine required it, but because he knew that in the next 72 hours, he was either going to save thousands of lives or destroy his entire military career, and either way, he wanted Morrison to know he appreciated the chance. Then he jumped off the Sherman, grabbed his rifle, and started walking back toward the motor pool. Behind him, 1st Platoon was still staring at the gap in the hedgerow. Behind him, Lieutenant Morrison was climbing back into his Sherman, probably wondering if he'd just helped a genius or aided and abetted the biggest breach of military protocol in the European theater. And behind him, somewhere in the German lines, enemy officers were starting to receive reports about an American tank that had done something impossible. They didn't know about Curtis Culin yet. They didn't know about the steel forks. They didn't know that a cab driver from Hell's Kitchen had just figured out how to break Hitler's Normandy defense with $3 worth of scrap metal. But they were about to find out. And by the time Operation Cobra launched, they were going to wish they'd never heard the name Curtis Culin. Because in 72 hours, the bocage was going to change. In 72 hours, Sherman tanks were going to transform from vulnerable targets into breakthrough weapons. In 72 hours, the deadlock that had plagued the American advance for 38 days was going to shatter. And it was all going to start with 4 pieces of welded steel and one cab driver who decided that sometimes you had to ignore the manual and build something that actually worked. But first, Curtis Culin had to survive the next 72 hours. He had to find enough scrap steel. He had to convince enough welders to work around the clock. He had to avoid every officer who might shut down his operation before it proved successful. And most importantly, he had to make sure that when July 25th arrived and Operation Cobra kicked off, there were enough modified Shermans to make a difference. The bocage stretched out before him, endless fields divided by endless hedgerows, 8 meters tall and impenetrable. Or at least, they used to be impenetrable. Now they were just obstacles. And Curtis Culin had just figured out how to turn obstacles into opportunities. He walked faster. The motor pool was 3 kilometers north. He had welding equipment there. He had 6 men who knew how to use a torch. He had access to the scrap pile. And somewhere on Utah Beach, there were hundreds of German beach obstacles just waiting to be cut up and repurposed into the device that was going to change everything. 72 hours. That's all he had. 72 hours to build an innovation that should have taken months of research and development. 72 hours to prove that sometimes the best engineers aren't the ones with degrees. They're the ones with dirty hands and desperate ideas and the absolute conviction that if something needs fixing, you fix it now, not after the committee approves it. Curtis Culin had spent 8 years fixing cabs in Hell's Kitchen. He'd fixed radiators and transmissions and brakes and engines, usually with improvised tools and salvaged parts because nobody had money for proper repairs during the Depression. He'd learned to make do. He'd learned to improvise. He'd learned that sometimes a bent coat hanger and some wire worked better than the official factory part. Now he was going to apply those same principles to armored warfare. And if it worked, when it worked, the U.S. Army was going to owe its Normandy breakthrough to a man who'd never attended West Point, never studied engineering, never read a single manual on tank tactics. A man who'd just looked at a problem, looked at some scrap metal and thought, yeah, I can fix that. But he wasn't done yet. The real work was just beginning. And somewhere behind him, German officers were starting to realize that something had changed, that the Americans had figured out something new, that the bocage wasn't going to save them anymore. The race was on. Curtis Culin had 71 hours and 43 minutes left when he walked into the 2nd Armored Division's motor pool at 0734 hours on July 14, 1944, and immediately realized his biggest problem wasn't going to be finding scrap metal or convincing welders to work around the clock. His biggest problem was standing right in front of him, wearing captain's bars and an expression that suggested he'd already heard about what happened at the hedgerow 3 kilometers south of St. Lo. Captain Edward Holbrook was 31 years old, a West Point graduate, and the battalion's maintenance officer. He was responsible for every piece of equipment in the 743rd Tank Battalion, which meant he was responsible for making sure nobody welded unauthorized modifications onto government property without proper authorization, testing, and approval from ordnance. He was also standing between Culin and the welding equipment with his arms crossed, and he did not look happy. "Sergeant Culin," Holbrook said. His voice was perfectly neutral, which was somehow worse than if he'd been yelling. "I've received 3 separate reports in the past hour about a Sherman tank that apparently went through a hedgerow instead of over it. Care to explain?" Culin had rehearsed this conversation on the walk back from the front. He'd prepared arguments about battlefield necessity and operational effectiveness and lives saved. He'd prepared statistics about tank losses and casualty rates. He'd prepared everything except the truth, which was that he'd violated about 15 different regulations and was about to ask permission to violate about 50 more. But standing there, looking at Holbrook's face, Culin made a decision that would either save his career or end it right there in the motor pool. "Sir," Culin said, "I welded 4 pieces of German beach obstacle steel onto the nose of Lieutenant Morrison's Sherman. Took me 10 hours. Cost about $3 in scrap metal. This morning at 0623, we used it to punch through a hedgerow that's killed 7 tanks in the past 2 weeks. Went through in 3 seconds. Didn't expose the belly armor. Didn't lose a single man. The German MG crews didn't even have time to adjust fire." He paused, watching Holbrook's expression. It hadn't changed. "Sir, I know I should have asked permission, but if I'd asked permission, you would have said no. And if you'd said no, Lieutenant Morrison and his crew would probably be dead right now." There was a long silence. Somewhere in the motor pool, a wrench clanged against concrete. Somewhere in the distance, artillery was rumbling, the constant background noise of the Normandy stalemate. Holbrook was staring at Culin, and Culin couldn't read his expression. West Point graduates were good at that, keeping their faces blank while they decided whether to promote you or court-martial you. "Show me," Holbrook said finally. Culin blinked. "Sir, show me the modification. Show me how it works. Show me why I shouldn't have you arrested for destroying government property and violating every ordnance regulation in the manual." Holbrook's expression still hadn't changed, but his voice had shifted slightly. There was something in it now. Something that might have been curiosity or might have been the recognition that 47 dead tank crewmen in 9 days was a problem that needed solving. Regulations be damned. Culin led Holbrook to the corner of the motor pool where he'd done the welding. The steel pieces were still there, cut from a German beach obstacle he'd salvaged from Utah Beach 2 days earlier. Rommel's Atlantic Wall had used thousands of these steel crosses designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft. Now they were just scrap metal sitting on the beaches, serving no purpose. Culin had realized something when he'd first seen them. Steel designed to stop tanks from landing could probably be repurposed to help tanks advance. He picked up one of the cut pieces. It was roughly 1 meter long, angled at 45 degrees, with a flat base that could be welded to a tank's glacis plate. The problem with hedgerows, Culin said, is that they're 8 meters of packed earth and roots. Standard doctrine says climb over them, but climbing exposes the belly armor at 35 degrees for about 4 seconds. That's all a German Panzerfaust crew needs. One shot to the engine compartment and the tank burns. Holbrook nodded. He'd seen it happen. Everyone had seen it happen. The bocage had turned Sherman tanks from offensive weapons into steel coffins. But if you don't climb over, Culin continued, if you cut through instead, you stay level. Armor stays angled. Crew stays alive. He held up the steel piece. These act like tusks. 4 of them welded to the front glacis in a specific pattern. When the tank hits the hedgerow, the steel digs into the earth, cuts the roots, parts the bramble. Physics does the rest. 33 tons of tank pushing forward, concentrated force through 4 steel points, and the hedgerow just opens. You tested this, Holbrook asked. Once. This morning. It worked. Once, Holbrook repeated. You tested it once, and now you want to weld these onto every tank in the battalion based on a single test? Sir, we don't have time for proper testing. Operation Cobra kicks off in 11 days. If we wait for ordnance to approve this, if we wait for proper engineering studies and field trials, Cobra's going to launch with the same tanks we've got now, and we're going to lose the same number of men we've been losing. Maybe more, because Cobra's going to require punching through 50, 60, maybe 100 hedgerows in the first day alone. Culin set the steel piece down. Sir, I've been a mechanic for 12 years. 8 years fixing cabs in New York. 4 years fixing tanks in the Army. I know when something works. This works. And every day we wait to implement it, more crews die. Holbrook was quiet for a long moment. He picked up the steel piece, examined the cut angle, tested the weight. Then he looked at Culin with an expression that was somewhere between respect and resignation. You realize what you're asking me to do, Sergeant. You're asking me to authorize a battlefield modification that hasn't been tested, hasn't been approved, and violates about 30 different regulations. If this fails, if these devices break off during combat, if they cause tanks to become unstable or throw tracks, or any of 100 other potential problems, I'm the one who authorized it. My career is over. Yes, sir. And if I say no, if I follow regulations and submit this through proper channels, you're planning to do it anyway, aren't you? Culin met Holbrook's eyes. Sir, I've got 71 hours left. Lieutenant Morrison gave me 72 hours to make this work before battalion officially finds out. I'm not asking for your authorization. I'm asking for your help, because I can probably modify 10, maybe 12 tanks on my own in that time. But if you give me access to all 6 welders in the maintenance company, if you give me authorization to requisition scrap from Utah Beach, if you tell your men to work on this instead of standard repairs, I can modify every Sherman in the battalion. Maybe more. Maybe enough to make Operation Cobra work. There was another long silence. Holbrook set the steel piece down carefully, like it was something fragile instead of a chunk of scrap metal. Then he did something Culin didn't expect. He smiled. It was a tired smile, the kind of smile men get when they realize they're about to make a decision that could end their career, but might save hundreds of lives. All right, Sergeant, you've got your welders, you've got your authorization, you've got 71 hours. Holbrook's smile faded. But you also got conditions. First, you test this modification on 3 more tanks before we go into mass production. I want to see it work on different terrain, different hedgerow densities, different angles of approach. Second, you document everything. Measurements, weld points, steel specifications, everything. If this works, Ordnance is going to want to know how to replicate it. Third, if anything goes wrong, if a single tank loses a track, or throws a bogey wheel, or has any mechanical failure that can be traced to your modification, you take full responsibility. Not me, not the maintenance company. You. Understood, sir. And fourth, Holbrook said, his voice dropping lower, you make this work. Because if Operation Cobra fails because our tanks can't get through the bocage, a lot of good men are gonna die. And I'd rather lose my career than live with that. Culin nodded, then he held out his hand. Holbrook shook it, and in that moment, Curtis Culin realized he'd just been given the resources to either save thousands of lives or destroy everything he'd worked for. There was no middle ground. Either the modification worked and became standard equipment, or it failed and he spent the rest of the war in the stockade. The next 71 hours became a blur of welding torches and scrap metal and tanks. Culin organized the maintenance company into 3 shifts working around the clock. 6 welders, 12 assistants working in pairs on 4 tanks simultaneously. The motor pool turned into something that looked more like a factory than a military facility. Sparks flew constantly. The smell of burning metal hung in the air. And slowly, one by one, Sherman tanks that had been vulnerable death traps started transforming into something different. The steel forks, someone started calling them tusks, then rhino horns, and eventually just the rhino device, required precise measurements. Each piece had to be cut to exactly 1 meter length. Each piece had to be angled at exactly 45 degrees. Each piece had to be welded to the glacis plate in a specific pattern. 2 outer tusks angled slightly outward, 2 inner tusks pointed straight ahead, all 4 positioned to maximize penetration while distributing force evenly across the tank's front armor. Culin had done the first modification by eye, using instinct and 12 years of mechanical experience. Now he had to create specifications that welders with varying skill levels could follow. He spent 4 hours on July 14th measuring and remeasuring Morrison's tank, documenting every weld point, every angle, every dimension. Then he created a template, a physical guide that could be placed on any Sherman to mark where the tusks should be attached. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't official, but it worked. By 1800 hours on July 14th, 3 more tanks had been modified. Holbrook insisted on testing all 3 before authorizing mass production. The test took place 2 kilometers south of the motor pool, in a section of bocage that had been cleared of Germans, but was still thick with hedgerows. Culin rode on the first tank just like he'd done that morning. The rhino device cut through the hedgerow in 2.8 seconds. The second tank went through in 3.1 seconds. The third tank hit a particularly thick root system and took 4.2 seconds, but it still went through without exposing its belly armor. Holbrook watched all 3 tests without saying a word. When the third tank emerged from the hedgerow, he turned to Culin and said, "Start mass production. I want 20 tanks modified by midnight, 40 by tomorrow noon, every tank in the battalion by July 16th. The welders worked in shifts. When one team got too exhausted to safely operate torches, another team took over. Culin barely slept. He spent 18 hours on July 15th supervising modifications, checking welds, making sure every tank met specifications. His hands were covered in burns from hot metal. His eyes were bloodshot from welding flash. His voice was hoarse from shouting instructions over the roar of cutting torches and grinding wheels. But the tanks kept getting modified. Word spread fast. Other units heard about what was happening in the 2nd Armored Division's motor pool. Officers from other battalions started showing up, asking questions, wanting to see the modification. Some were skeptical, some were interested, some were outright hostile, claiming that field modifications without ordnance approval were dangerous and irresponsible. Holbrook turned them all away. "Come back after Operation Cobra," he told them. "If this works, you can copy it. If it doesn't work, you can court-martial us." By July 16th, 47 tanks in the 743rd Tank Battalion had been modified. Every operational Sherman now had 4 steel tusks welded to its nose. The battalion looked different, transformed from a standard armored unit into something that resembled a herd of mechanical rhinoceroses. Tank crews were painting names on the devices: Hedgerow Buster, Nazi Mower, Bocage Killer. The men were excited. For the first time since landing in Normandy, they had a weapon that might actually let them advance without dying. But Culin wasn't done. The 743rd was 1 battalion in a division that had 6 tank battalions. The 2nd Armored Division had approximately 200 Sherman tanks, and the 2nd Armored was one of multiple armored divisions preparing for Operation Cobra. If the Rhino device was going to make a real difference, it needed to spread beyond the 743rd. On July 17th, Culin received orders to report to division headquarters. He walked into the briefing room expecting to be court-martialed. Instead, he found himself standing in front of Major General Ernest Harmon, commanding general of the 2nd Armored Division. Harmon was 51 years old, a career cavalry officer who'd commanded tanks since North Africa. He was also known for two things: brilliant tactical innovation and absolutely zero tolerance for bullshit. Harmon looked at Culin for a long moment. Then he said, "Sergeant, I've received reports that you've been welding scrap metal onto my tanks without authorization." "Yes, sir." "And that these modifications allow tanks to punch through hedgerows without exposing their belly armor." "Yes, sir." "And that you've modified 47 tanks in 72 hours using German beach obstacles and maintenance company welders." "Yes, sir." Harmon leaned back in his chair. "Show me." 20 minutes later, Harmon was standing in a field watching a modified Sherman punch through a hedgerow in 3.4 seconds. He watched it happen 3 more times, each time from a different angle, each time studying the mechanics of how the steel tusks cut through earth and roots. Then he turned to Culin and asked the question that would change everything. "How many of these can you make?" Culin did the math in his head. 6 welders per battalion, 6 tank battalions in the division, roughly 200 tanks total. "Sir, if you give me access to all the maintenance companies in the division, I can modify every tank we've got in 5 days, maybe 4. "You've got 3, Harmon said. "Operation Cobra's been moved up. We launched July 25th. I need every tank in this division equipped with your device by July 24th. Can you do it?" Culin looked at the general, looked at the modified Sherman, looked at the hedgerow with a neat gap torn through its center, thought about 47 dead crewmen in 9 days, thought about how many more would die if Operation Cobra launched without adequate hedgerow breaking capability, thought about the fact that a major general was asking a sergeant if he could pull off something that should have taken months of engineering development and was expecting it to happen in 72 hours. "Yes, sir," Culin said. "We can do it." And they did. The next 3 days became the most intense production effort Culin had ever seen. Every maintenance company in the 2nd Armored Division started cutting steel and welding tusks. Word reached other divisions. The 3rd Armored Division sent observers. The 4th Infantry Division requested specifications. Within 48 hours, the modification that had started as one cab driver's improvised solution had spread to 3 different divisions. The Army called it the Culin device in official reports. The tank crews called it the Rhino. The Germans would eventually call it der Metallzahn, the metal tooth, when they realized what was ripping through their hedgerow defenses. But on July 24th, 1944, as Culin watched the last of 300-plus Sherman tanks receive their steel tusks, nobody was thinking about what the Germans would call it. They were thinking about Operation Cobra. They were thinking about the breakout. They were thinking about whether a cab driver's $3 modification was actually going to work when it mattered most. July 25th, 1944, 0938 hours. Operation Cobra kicked off with the largest aerial bombardment in the history of warfare. 500 heavy bombers, 380 medium bombers, and 550 fighter bombers dropped 4,000 tons of explosives on a 7-kilometer stretch of German defensive lines south of St. Lo. The ground shook. The sky turned black with smoke. And when the bombing stopped, the Sherman tanks equipped with Culin devices began their advance. Curtis Culin wasn't in the first wave. He was assigned to follow-on forces, which meant he spent the first 2 hours of Operation Cobra listening to radio reports and trying to figure out if his modification was working or if 300-plus tanks were about to discover that steel tusks didn't work as well in combat as they had in testing. The radio traffic was chaotic. Units reporting contact, units reporting breakthrough, units reporting hedgerows breached, but nothing definite, nothing clear. Just the fog of war and the waiting. At 11:47 hours, Cullen's unit crossed the line of departure. Within 5 minutes, they hit their first hedgerow. The Sherman in front of him, a tank from Baker Company with Rhino Killer painted on its tusks, accelerated to 15 kilometers per hour and hit the hedgerow head-on. 3 seconds later, it was through. The second hedgerow took 2.9 seconds. The third took 3.8 seconds because of a particularly thick root system, but it still breached. By 1300 hours, Culin's battalion had advanced 3 kilometers. 3 kilometers in 3 hours. That might not sound impressive, but in the bocage, where 8 kilometers had taken 38 days, 3 kilometers in 3 hours was revolutionary. The Rhino devices were working. They were working better than anyone had expected. Tanks that should have been stopped by the first hedgerow line were punching through 10, 15, 20 hedgerows in a single day. The German defenders were unprepared. Their entire defensive doctrine was built around the assumption that American tanks couldn't breach hedgerows without exposing themselves to Panzerfaust fire. They'd position their anti-tank weapons accordingly, sighted for targets that would appear above hedgerows, not through them. When Sherman tanks started punching through hedgerows at ground level, German AT crews found themselves shooting at angles they'd never practiced, at ranges they'd never calculated, at targets that appeared and disappeared faster than they could adjust fire. By the end of July 25th, the 2nd Armored Division had advanced 8 kilometers. 8 kilometers in one day. The same distance that had taken 38 days in June was covered in one day in July. And the Rhino devices had suffered exactly 0 mechanical failures. No tusks had broken off, no tanks had thrown tracks, no crews had been lost because of the modification. The only casualties came from German positions that tanks had successfully breached before infantry could clear them. And even those casualties were lower than expected because tanks were spending less time exposed in kill zones. July 26th was even better, 12 kilometers. July 27th, 15 kilometers. The bocage that had been an impenetrable barrier became a series of obstacles that tanks punched through like paper. German defensive lines that should have held for weeks collapsed in days. And, somewhere in the chaos of the breakout, someone in 7 Corps headquarters realized that the Culin device wasn't just a clever modification. It was the reason Operation Cobra was succeeding. On July 28th, Curtis Culin received orders to report to 1st Army headquarters. He walked into a briefing room and found himself standing in front of Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding general of the 1st Army, and the man responsible for planning Operation Cobra. Bradley was 51 years old, a West Point graduate, and widely considered one of the most brilliant operational commanders in the European theater. He was also the man who'd spent 6 weeks trying to figure out how to break through the bocage without losing half his armored force. Bradley looked at Culin. Then he looked at the technical drawings of the Culin device that were spread across the table. Then he looked back at Culin and said something that would be recorded in the official history of Operation Cobra. "Sergeant, do you have any idea what you've done?" Culin wasn't sure how to answer that. "Sir, I welded some steel onto tanks." "You broke the bocage," Bradley said. "You broke the stalemate. You turned Operation Cobra from a calculated risk into a guaranteed success." He picked up one of the technical drawings. "We've got reports from 12 different divisions. Every unit equipped with your device is advancing 2 to 3 times faster than projected. German casualties are 3 times higher than expected. Their defensive lines are collapsing because they can't reposition fast enough to counter tanks that can breach any hedgerow in under 5 seconds. Bradley set the drawing down. "Ordnance wants to study this. They want to run tests. They want to figure out why we didn't think of this 6 months ago when we were planning the invasion." He paused. "I told them they can study it after we win the war. Right now, I want every tank in the 1st Army equipped with this device. Can you make that happen?" Culin did math in his head. 1st Army had approximately 1,200 tanks. Even with every maintenance company working around the clock, modifying 1,200 tanks would take weeks. But he'd learned something in the past 2 weeks. When a general asks if you can do something, the correct answer is always, "Yes, sir." "Yes, sir, we can do it." And they did. By August 10th, 1944, more than 800 Sherman tanks in the 1st Army had been equipped with Culin devices. The modification had spread beyond the 2nd Armored Division, beyond 7 Corps, beyond even 1st Army. 3rd Army heard about it. British 2nd Army heard about it. Within 3 weeks, the improvised solution that had started with 1 cab driver and 4 pieces of scrap steel had become standard equipment across the entire Allied expeditionary force. The breakout from Normandy succeeded. Operation Cobra achieved all its objectives and then some. By August 25th, Paris was liberated. By September, Allied forces were approaching the German border, and military historians would later identify the Culin device as one of the critical innovations that made the rapid advance possible. But Curtis Culin didn't see most of this. On August 3, 1944, his Sherman took a German 80mm round through the turret during a German counterattack near Morton. Culin survived with shrapnel wounds to his left arm and severe burns to his face and hands. He was evacuated to a field hospital, then to England, then back to the United States for extended recovery. He spent 6 months in hospitals. By the time he was cleared for duty in February 1945, the war in Europe was almost over. He never went back to France. He never saw the mass production of his device. He never watched as hundreds of Sherman tanks equipped with steel tusks punched through the Siegfried Line, crossed the Rhine, and drove into Germany. He just recovered in a hospital bed, reading newspaper reports about Allied advances, knowing that somewhere out there, tanks were using the modification he'd invented, but unable to verify if they were actually making a difference. The Army awarded him the Legion of Merit for exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services. The citation mentioned innovative solutions to tactical problems and significant contributions to armored warfare doctrine. It didn't mention that he'd violated regulations. It didn't mention that he'd started work without authorization. It didn't mention the 72-hour deadline or the 3-day production sprint or the moment when a major general had asked a sergeant if he could modify 200 tanks, and the sergeant had said yes. Curtis Culin was discharged from the Army in October 1945. He returned to New York City. He went back to driving cabs. He married in 1947, had 2 children, worked the night shift driving passengers through Manhattan for 23 years. His kids knew their father had served in the war. They knew he'd been wounded. They didn't know he'd invented anything. They didn't know his modification had been used on more than 1,000 tanks. They didn't know that military historians would later estimate the Culin device had saved between 800 and 1,200 American lives during the Normandy breakout. Culin didn't talk about it. When people asked about the war, he'd say he'd been a tanker, got hit by German artillery, came home. If they pressed for details, he'd change the subject. He'd learned something during 8 years driving cabs in Hell's Kitchen. Nobody wanted to hear war stories. They wanted to get where they were going. They wanted to talk about baseball or politics or the weather. They didn't want to hear about hedgerows and steel tusks and 72-hour production deadlines. In 1956, a military historian named Dr. Martin Blumenson was researching the Normandy campaign for the official U.S. Army history. He came across references to the Culin device in after-action reports. He traced the innovation back to the 2nd Armored Division. He found Curtis Culin's name in personnel records, and he spent 3 months trying to locate Culin to interview him about the invention. He found Culin driving a cab in Manhattan, knocked on his apartment door one evening, introduced himself, asked if Culin would be willing to talk about the hedgerow modification. Culin's response was recorded in Blumenson's research notes. "I just welded some steel onto tanks. Lots of people did stuff like that. Why do you care?" Blumenson explained that the Culin device had changed armored warfare doctrine, that it had enabled the Normandy breakout, that it had been studied by armor schools and incorporated into post-war tank design, that Culin's name appeared in dozens of official reports and was cited in tactical manuals. Culin's response, didn't know that." The interview lasted 2 hours. Blumenson's notes described Culin as reluctant to take credit, focused on practical details rather than historical significance, and more interested in discussing mechanical specifications than tactical impact. When asked if he felt proud of his contribution to the war effort, Culin reportedly said, "I was just trying to keep my buddies alive. Seemed like the right thing to do." The official U.S. Army history of the Normandy campaign, published in 1961, includes 3 paragraphs about the Culin device. It describes the innovation, the rapid production, the tactical impact. It mentions Curtis Culin by name exactly once. Most readers probably skipped over it, more interested in the big battles and famous generals than in a sergeant who'd welded scrap metal onto tanks. Curtis Culin died on January 3, 1963, at age 42, from complications related to his war wounds and years of smoking. His obituary in the New York Times was 4 sentences long. It mentioned he was a veteran and a cab driver. It didn't mention the Culin device. It didn't mention Operation Cobra. It didn't mention that his modification had been used on more than 1,000 tanks and had fundamentally changed how armored units approached obstacles. His widow found a box in their apartment after he died. Inside were newspaper clippings about Operation Cobra, technical drawings of the Rhino device, a copy of the Legion of Merit citation, letters from tank crews thanking him for the modification that had saved their lives. She'd had no idea. Culin had kept it all hidden, never mentioned it, never brought it up, just kept driving his cab, raising his kids, living a quiet life in New York City. In 1974, 11 years after Cullin's death, the U.S. Army Armor School at Fort Knox added a section to their curriculum about field expedient modifications and used the Culin device as the primary case study. They taught it to every armor officer for the next 40 years. They explained the mechanics, the production process, the tactical impact. They showed pictures of modified Sherman tanks punching through hedgerows. And they mentioned Curtis Culin's name, though by then, most instructors had no idea who he actually was beyond the sergeant who invented the Rhino device. In 1994, 50 years after Operation Cobra, French authorities installed a memorial near St. Lo commemorating the Normandy breakout. The memorial includes a piece of an actual Culin device recovered from a Sherman tank that had been abandoned near the hedgerows in 1944. The plaque describes the innovation and its impact. It mentions Curtis Culin's name. Tourists walk past it every day, taking pictures, reading the plaque, learning about the tank modification that changed the war. Most of them probably don't think much about the man who invented it, about the cab driver who spent 72 hours welding scrap metal in a motor pool and never expected anyone to remember. But historians remember, armor officers remember, and somewhere in the official records of the U.S. Army, in after-action reports and tactical studies and equipment modification logs, Curtis Cullin's name appears hundreds of times, attached to the innovation that broke the bocage and saved somewhere between 800 and 1,200 lives during the summer of 1944. That's how innovation actually happens in war, not through committees or research programs or months of testing and development. Through soldiers who see problems and solve them immediately, who ignore doctrine when doctrine kills people, who weld scrap metal onto tanks at 200 hours because the alternative is watching their friends die in hedgerows. Through mechanics who spend 12 years fixing cabs and then apply those same skills to fixing tanks. Through sergeants who take risks that could end their careers because saving lives matters more than following regulations. Curtis Culin cut steel for 72 hours straight, modified 47 tanks before anyone in authority could stop him, sparked a production effort that equipped more than 1,000 tanks in 3 weeks, changed armored warfare doctrine, enabled the Normandy breakout, saved hundreds of lives, and then went back to driving cabs in New York City and never talked about it. His name should be taught in every military academy. His innovation should be required study for every armor officer. His story should be told alongside Patton and Bradley and Eisenhower, but it's not. Most people have never heard of Curtis Culin. Most military historians have to look up his name. Most tank crews don't know who invented the modification that saved their predecessors' lives 70 years ago. But you know now. You know about the cab driver who became a sergeant, the sergeant who became an innovator, the innovator who became a casualty, and the casualty who went home and drove cabs and raised kids and died at 42 with a box of clippings hidden in his apartment that his own family didn't know existed. You know about the 72 hours that changed the war. You know about the $3 worth of scrap steel that broke Hitler's Normandy defense. You know about the Rhino device that punched through hedgerows and doctrine and regulations and turned the bocage from an impenetrable barrier into a series of obstacles that tanks could breach in 3 seconds. And you know that sometimes the most important innovations in history come from the most unlikely people, not from generals or engineers or scientists, but from cab drivers who know how to weld, who know how to fix things, and who know that when people are dying because of a technical problem, you don't wait for authorization to fix it. You just fix it. Curtis Culin fixed it, and then he went home and drove cabs and never asked for recognition, never demanded credit, never wrote memoirs or gave speeches or sought glory, just lived quietly, raised his family, and let history decide whether anyone would remember. History has decided. The U.S. Army remembers. armor schools remember. The memorial at St. Lo remembers. And now you remember too. If this story moved you the way it's moved thousands of military historians and armor officers and soldiers who understand what it means to solve problems under fire, do something that Curtis Culin never got the chance to see. Share this story. Tell people about the cab driver who changed the war. Tell them about the 72 hours, the scrap steel, the modified tanks, the lives saved. Tell them that innovation doesn't always come from the people with the most credentials, or the highest ranks, or the biggest budgets. Sometimes it comes from sergeants with dirty hands and desperate ideas and the absolute conviction that if something needs fixing, you fix it now. Not after the committee approves it, not after ordnance runs tests, not after the manual gets updated. Now, because lives depend on it. Curtis Culin understood that, and for 72 hours in July 1944, he proved it.